Let's take a step back, because what just happened is being misread by almost everyone following the headlines. This is not a story about Venezuela. It is not even really a story about Maduro as a political figure. What unfolded over the last few hours was a trigger event, a spark that ignited pressure inside a system that had already been stretched to its limits. When the United States moved directly against Maduro and tightened its grip on Venezuelan waters, it was not simply enforcing sanctions or sending a warning to a hostile regime. It was applying pressure to a strategic artery, and that artery is oil. In geopolitics, oil is never local. The moment production or exports are disrupted anywhere, the shock does not remain confined. It travels outward through shipping networks, insurance markets, financial systems, and alliances. This time, that shock did not stop in Caracas. It moved straight to Beijing. For years, Venezuela has functioned as a discounted energy supplier to China. Not loudly, not ceremonially, quietly and efficiently. As Western buyers stepped away under sanctions, Chinese refiners stepped in, absorbing the risk in exchange for steep discounts. Over time, that flow became more than opportunistic. It became embedded in Beijing's broader energy security strategy. Venezuelan crude was integrated into refinery configurations, pricing models, and long-term planning. So when Washington escalated its actions against Maduro, it did not just target a government it considers hostile. It disrupted a flow that China depends on. And that is the moment this situation crossed from regional enforcement into global confrontation. Public explanations focus on cartels, corruption, or regime stability. Those narratives are convenient, but they are superficial. Beneath them lies a consistent and well-documented pattern. When the United States wants leverage, it rarely starts with direct force. It starts with choke points, shipping lanes, port access, compliance regimes, insurance coverage, naval presence that raises just enough uncertainty to change behavior. Control the movement of energy, and you control the tempo of entire economies. By exerting pressure on Venezuelan exports, Washington did not need to stop every tanker or declare a formal blockade. It only needed to inject doubt. Once that doubt enters the system, everything begins to slow. Insurers reassess risk and raise premiums. Shipping companies hesitate. Traders delay contracts. Even vessels that remain technically compliant begin to avoid the region because time itself becomes expensive. A single day of delay for a large crude carrier can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Multiply that across inspections, rerouting, idle waiting, and the economics stop making sense. The result is self-enforcing. Ships turn away before they are intercepted. Contracts are cancelled before penalties are discussed. What looks like enforcement on paper becomes something far more powerful in practice. A market-wide refusal to engage. This is how modern economic warfare works. It is quiet, it is procedural, and it is devastatingly effective. But here is the critical mistake many observers are making. They assume this pressure was aimed only at Venezuela. It was not. Venezuela is the lever, not the target. The real target sits thousands of miles away, refining that crude, absorbing those discounts, and integrating that supply into a much larger industrial system. For China, energy security is not a secondary concern. It is national security. A manufacturing superpower cannot tolerate unpredictable input flows. Every refinery disruption tightens margins. Every supply interruption forces replanning. And every demonstration that those flows can be disrupted by a rival power forces a reassessment of risk at the highest levels. That is why the reaction we are now witnessing was inevitable. Once shipments slow, once production drops, once storage tanks begin to fill and exports stall, the damage does not remain local. It radiates outward. Chinese refiners feel it almost immediately. Input costs rise. Strategic forecasts become unreliable. Contingency plans move from theory into urgency. At that point, Beijing does not see a regional dispute. It sees a warning, a reminder that physical supply chains remain vulnerable to American power projection. And when that realization sets in, the response does not come in the form of outrage or speeches. It comes in calculation. The move against Maduro was not an isolated enforcement action. It was a signal. And signals in geopolitics are rarely sent without being received. Once Venezuelan shipments begin to slow, the damage spreads far faster than most people expect. This is not because oil is rare, but because oil systems are tightly calibrated. Production, storage, shipping, and refining are synchronized across continents. When one segment seizes, the stress propagates instantly. Inside Venezuela, the effects are immediate. When exports stall, storage tanks begin to fill. When tanks fill, production must slow or stop. Oil cannot simply be stockpiled indefinitely, especially in a system already weakened by underinvestment, technical decay, and sanctions. By targeting exit points rather than wells, the United States applied maximum pressure with minimal direct intervention. But the real consequences appear further downstream. Every barrel that fails to leave Venezuelan ports is a barrel that fails to reach a refinery somewhere else. For China, that absence matters far more than headlines suggest. Chinese refiners are not just buyers, they are planners. Their operations are built around predictable flows, long-term discounts, and finely managed margins. Venezuelan crude, sold at steep reductions due to political isolation, had become an integral input. When those shipments slow or stop, it is not merely an inconvenience. It is a disruption to cost structures, supply forecasts, and strategic assumptions. Refiners configured for heavy crude cannot instantly substitute lighter grades without efficiency losses. These are technical constraints that rarely appear in media coverage, but they matter enormously. Energy systems are not plug-and-play. They are optimized over years. From Beijing's perspective, the United States had effectively imposed an energy tax on China without passing a single tariff. That is where the confrontation begins to change form. Washington has unmatched naval reach and an unparalleled ability to enforce sanctions across oceans. China understands this reality clearly. It also understands that attempting to respond symmetrically, ship for ship or patrol for patrol, would be slow, expensive, and dangerously escalatory. Instead, Beijing looks for asymmetry. The Venezuelan episode exposes a vulnerability China has long understood but hoped to manage quietly. Physical supply chains remain exposed to American power projection. No matter how diversified suppliers become, the movement of energy still depends on routes, choke points, and enforcement regimes influenced by the United States and its allies. This realization forces a reassessment. China does not interpret the move against Maduro as a temporary disruption. It interprets it as a rehearsal, a demonstration of how pressure could be applied elsewhere in the future. Latin America today, another region tomorrow. The logic is not about Venezuela itself. It is about precedent. At the same time, the global oil market begins to reprice risk. Fewer barrels on the water tighten supply expectations. Volatility creeps in. Traders factor geopolitical premiums into contracts. These shifts feed directly into inflation assumptions, interest rate expectations, and broader market sentiment. A regional enforcement action begins influencing asset prices far beyond Latin America. Meanwhile, the enforcement effort itself grows more complex. Shadow fleets expand. Tankers change flags. Paper ownership moves through shell entities. Ships repaint hulls, alter registries, and play jurisdictional games to slip through enforcement gaps. Each maneuver raises the risk of miscalculation, a wrong boarding, a misidentified vessel, a diplomatic incident involving a third party. The system becomes a high-stakes game of cat and mouse on open water. And while that drama unfolds, the underlying cost continues to rise. Maintaining naval presence is expensive. Every patrol, every extended deployment, every inspection feeds into fiscal strain. The price of global policing becomes more visible, even as its necessity is rarely questioned in Washington. From Beijing's perspective, this linkage is critical. The United States can enforce pressure through physical dominance, but it does so at enormous financial cost. High deficits are not abstract numbers. They translate into higher borrowing, heavier debt servicing, and increased reliance on global capital markets. This is where the logic turns. If Washington insists on using force to control supply chains, it exposes itself financially. And financial exposure is precisely where China holds leverage. Currency and capital markets do not require fleets. They require confidence, participation, expectation, and they can shift far faster than any naval buildup. The Venezuelan oil squeeze, therefore, is not an isolated pressure point. It is a stress fracture in a much larger structure. As production falls and shipments stall, China absorbs the signal and recalibrates. It recognizes that cheap energy secured through geopolitics can be interrupted by geopolitics. Once that realization sets in, the imperative becomes clear. Reduce vulnerability, counter pressure, shift the battlefield. This is the moment where the confrontation quietly leaves the water and enters balance sheets. Oil enforcement does its job, but it also accelerates the transition to a new phase of conflict. One where the levers are financial, the weapons are currencies, and the consequences ripple through markets rather than ports. What looks like an energy squeeze is, in reality, the prelude to something far more destabilizing. Because once finance is pulled into the equation, every investor, every pension fund, and every central bank becomes part of the battlefield, whether they intend to or not. And that is the phase now beginning. At this stage, the confrontation undergoes its final transformation. What began as pressure on a sanctioned producer has now evolved into a strategic collision with a far larger power. From Washington's perspective, the action against Venezuela is framed as enforcement against a hostile regime. From Beijing's perspective, the signal is unmistakable. A critical energy artery feeding Chinese industry has been deliberately constricted. This is where the miscalculation becomes visible. Venezuela may be economically insignificant to the United States, but it is operationally significant to China. For years, Chinese refiners absorbed the political and reputational risk Western buyers avoided. They locked in discounted supply, integrated that crude into long-term planning, and treated Venezuelan oil as a pragmatic input, not an ideological commitment. When that flow is disrupted, the loss is not just measured in barrels, it is measured in leverage. Discounts vanish, refining margins compress, strategic flexibility shrinks, and perhaps most importantly, a precedent is set. If the United States can throttle one politically isolated supplier today, it can do the same to others tomorrow. That realization fundamentally alters China's risk calculus. This is where the response shifts decisively away from oil itself and toward the system that governs global trade. China cannot immediately neutralize American naval dominance, but it does not need to. Instead, it focuses on reducing exposure to the system that makes such dominance effective. That system is not the ocean. It is the dollar-centric financial architecture that underwrites shipping, insurance, trade settlement, and reserves. This is why currency enters the picture not as a technical adjustment, but as a strategic signal. China does not announce a currency war. It never needs to. Instead, it allows markets to see what it is willing to tolerate and what it is no longer willing to suppress. For years, Beijing carefully managed its currency to support exports, absorbing criticism about manipulation. That posture made sense when growth depended primarily on price competitiveness. But the context has changed. When access itself becomes the weapon, cheap exports matter less than resilience, capital attraction, and leverage. Allowing the currency to strengthen sends a message. It tells markets that Beijing is prepared to trade some export advantage for broader strategic gains. A stronger currency does several things at once. It attracts capital at a moment when the United States is weighed down by deficits, heavy debt issuance, and rising interest costs. Global capital is opportunistic. It moves toward yield, stability, and perceived strategic coherence. When investors see a currency backed by a state signaling confidence rather than defense, they respond. At the same time, currency strength undermines Washington's long-standing political narrative. A firmer Chinese currency blunts accusations of exporting deflation through artificially cheap goods. That weakens the justification for tariffs among allies. It also increases China's purchasing power abroad, making real assets more accessible. Energy projects, infrastructure, commodities, and gold all become cheaper in relative terms. Gold, in particular, matters. Accumulating it is not just hedging. It is signaling a desire to reduce reliance on paper claims and external currencies. It reinforces the message that financial autonomy is becoming a priority. Meanwhile, the United States faces a dilemma of its own making. Maintaining global enforcement requires constant borrowing. Borrowing increases debt supply. Increased supply demands higher yields. Higher yields strain the domestic economy and inflate interest expenses. This places persistent downward pressure on the dollar's long-term appeal, even as it remains dominant in the short term. This creates a paradox. Higher yields attract capital, but they also signal fiscal stress. Confidence is not binary. It erodes gradually. The Venezuelan episode accelerates that erosion by highlighting the feedback loop between geopolitical enforcement and financial fragility. China's strategy exploits this tension patiently. It does not shock markets. It allows trends to develop organically. Currency appreciation is framed as market-driven. Policy signals are subtle. Regulatory adjustments are incremental. But the cumulative effect is powerful. Even small reallocations matter. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks do not need to abandon the dollar to change the landscape. A few percentage points shifted at the margin can move markets, influence exchange rates, and alter policy responses. This is where the currency war intersects directly with the real economy. Trade settlement practices begin to evolve. Bilateral agreements denominated in alternative currencies become more attractive. Over time, exclusivity diminishes. Sanctions lose potency. Enforcement loses reach. The irony is unmistakable. By leaning on physical control of supply chains, Washington accelerates the search for alternatives to the system that enables that control. What was meant to demonstrate strength instead reveals cost. This does not mean American power is collapsing or that the dollar is finished. It means the margin of error is shrinking. In a world where alternatives are becoming more viable, pressure loses some of its bite. The Venezuelan oil squeeze did not create this confrontation. It exposed it. Energy dependence, financial fragility, and currency leverage have been converging for years. What changed is that the lines between them are now visible. The confrontation has moved beyond tankers and ports. It now unfolds in balance sheets, reserve allocations, and exchange rate expectations. These battles are quieter, slower, and far harder to reverse. Oil was the spark. Currency is the fire. And once that fire spreads through markets rather than geography, the outcome is no longer controlled by who commands the seas, but by who commands confidence. That is the real story unfolding now.